A single phone call shattered the silence of Ouagadougou's night. On the line was not a partner, not a friend, but Benjamin Netanyahu, and his words carried the weight of an ultimatum. 48 hours. That was all the time given to a young president, Ibrahim Traoré, to resign, to restore suspended mining deals worth billions of dollars, to reopen security ties that served everyone but his own people. This was not diplomacy. It was coercion dressed as dialogue. The ultimatum struck at the very soul of sovereignty. How could a nation of 20 million, with an economy of barely 20 billion, be commanded by powers whose wealth is measured in trillions? Yet history shows that Africa's story has never been written in silence. From the cries of independence to the struggles of dignity, the soil remembers each test, each challenge. Now the clock is ticking again. Will Burkina Faso bend beneath the weight of threats or rise to redefine the rules of power? Do not look away. What comes next may change how we read the map. Subscribe and keep watching. The story begins not with armies on the march or tanks crossing borders, but with a voice carried across the phone lines in the stillness of midnight. Benjamin Netanyahu, Prime Minister of Israel, reached across continents to deliver a demand that shook the presidential palace of Ouagadougou. He gave Ibrahim Traoré, the young leader of Burkina Faso, a deadline that seemed less like dialogue and more like a dagger pressed to the throat of a sovereign state. 48 hours. Resign, restore Israel's suspended mining concessions worth billions, and re-enter the embrace of security agreements designed to serve foreign interests. For a nation already burdened by poverty, insecurity, and decades of outside interference, the ultimatum was more than a political challenge. It was a symbol of how little Africa's sovereignty was valued in the calculus of global power. In the language of contracts and trade, Traoré's people were reduced to figures on a balance sheet, their gold and oil framed not as resources to uplift a nation, but as assets to be unlocked by outsiders. In that moment, the palace advisors knew that this was no ordinary negotiation. It was a calculated attempt at regime change. The stakes were immense. Burkina Faso's economy, just over $20 billion in size, was dwarfed by the financial might of the countries behind the ultimatum. Its citizens, many surviving on less than $3 a day, had little in material wealth but carried the weight of dignity that no currency could measure. Could one small, landlocked country resist the machinery of pressure deployed against it? On the streets of Ouagadougou, rumors spread quickly. People whispered of contracts signed in Paris, loans dictated from Washington, concessions mined by corporations whose headquarters lay oceans away. They knew the pattern. For generations, Africa had been treated not as a partner, but as a marketplace to be carved, a vault to be opened. Was this ultimatum not simply a new mask for an old face? Neo-colonialism, dressed in the language of security? Traoré faced a choice. He did not command nuclear arsenals, nor did he possess armies that could match the military might of those who issued the threat. His greatest weapon was refusal, the power to say no when the world expected surrender. But even that power was fraught with danger. Refusal could mean isolation, sanctions, even an orchestrated collapse. Yet compliance would mean something worse: the erosion of dignity, the reduction of sovereignty to a commodity traded in dollars per ounce of gold or barrels of oil. Every second of the 48-hour countdown carried both fear and resolve. Advisors debated possible outcomes. Military officers tightened security around the palace, and ordinary citizens speculated whether their young president would stand or fall. The ultimatum had thrown not only a government, but an entire nation into suspense. And yet history has always taught that pressure can be more than a test. It can be a catalyst. Across the continent, from Bamako to Niamey, leaders watched closely. If Burkina Faso yielded, a precedent would be set, making every small nation more vulnerable to external dictates. If it resisted, however, it could ignite a flame of defiance with consequences beyond its borders. The image of the ticking clock became more than a metaphor. It was painted in murals, spoken of in cafes, whispered about in crowded markets. Each hour represented not just the narrowing time for decision, but the collective heartbeat of a people whose dignity had been challenged once again. In the palace halls, silence carried its own weight. Traoré was young, but he understood the burden of history. Leaders before him had been toppled by coups, assassinations, and economic sabotage. He knew the risks, but he also knew that history remembers those who refuse to kneel. As the first day of the ultimatum passed, anxiety deepened. Financial markets speculated, Foreign media outlets began to circulate unconfirmed reports of Traoré's impending resignation, and analysts warned that the fragile Burkina Faso economy could not withstand prolonged pressure. Every whisper seemed to tighten the noose. Yet amidst this growing tension, a question echoed louder. Could sovereignty itself be wielded as a weapon? The world watched as the deadline drew nearer. A single choice stood before Burkina Faso: bow to power or stand for dignity. But in that silence before the deadline expired, one word would change everything. When the silence could have been mistaken for surrender, Ibrahim Traoré broke it with a single word. Never. It was not a speech. It was not a negotiation. It was defiance distilled into one syllable, hurled like a spear against the weight of history. For a leader without nuclear weapons, without vast armies or deep financial reserves, the refusal itself became the ultimate weapon. The power of never rippled outward. Within hours, alliances began to crystallize. From across the Atlantic, Venezuela extended an unexpected lifeline, offering political asylum should the storm grow unbearable. A reminder that the spirit of resistance echoed far beyond Africa's shores. In Tehran, the promise of cyber defense arrived. Firewalls and digital shields would stand where tanks could not. A new kind of battlefield where the lines were drawn not on maps but in code. Moscow entered the scene with signals of military advisors ready to deploy. Though no dollar figure was attached, the gesture carried symbolic weight. Beijing, calculating its moves with characteristic precision, offered soft loans and infrastructure investments worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Sums that, for Burkina Faso's fragile economy, were not mere aid but survival. But resistance was not built only through external alliances. It surged within the people themselves. In the streets of Ouagadougou, the ultimatum leaked like a spark, igniting chants that grew into thunder. We choose Traoré, not Tel Aviv. Mothers carried children as they marched. Students waved banners, elders invoked memories of struggles long past. For many earning less than $3 a day, the words of solidarity became wealth more valuable than any reserve of gold or oil. Yet as hope swelled, so too did the counterattack. The theater of shadows unfolded. Banking systems flickered and failed. Transactions froze, remittances disappeared, and in 48 hours an estimated $50 million evaporated into the abyss of cyber sabotage. Power grids trembled, phone lines distorted, media outlets filled with doctored images and fake reports of Traoré's resignation. Western analysts speculated on looming collapse. Wall Street whispered. European banks recalculated risks. Fear was weaponized, not through bullets but through data breaches and manipulated narratives. Still, resilience surfaced in unexpected places. Across Africa, digital volunteers rose. Students, engineers, and activists formed what they called the firewall of dignity. They dissected false videos frame by frame, exposed fabricated headlines, and flooded social networks with counter-narratives. In Lagos, Nairobi, Johannesburg, young Africans live-streamed teach-ins on cyber sovereignty. What began as an assault meant to isolate Burkina Faso instead sparked a continental awakening. The countdown of fear was being transformed into 48 hours of defiance. The paradox grew sharper. On one side, banks faltered, and families were left without access to vital remittances. A devastating blow in a country where $400 million in such flows sustain households each year. On the other side, solidarity surged across borders. Hashtags climbed global trends. Murals of Traoré appeared overnight. What was meant to terrify became a rallying cry. The ultimatum had forced Africa into a moment of choice. Was this confrontation merely about Burkina Faso, or was it the opening chapter of a larger continental struggle against coercion? Leaders in Mali, Niger, and Chad watched carefully. If one ultimatum could be resisted, then perhaps the myth of inevitable submission was broken. By the second day, the stakes had risen beyond economics or politics. The question was no longer whether a government would survive, but whether sovereignty itself could be defended in the 21st century. Not by might, but by dignity, unity, and the refusal to yield. And as the 48 hours neared their end, the world held its breath. Would Burkina Faso collapse under pressure, or would it stand as the spark of a revolution far greater than itself? The 48 hours of defiance did not pass without scars. For ordinary Burkina Faso citizens, the price of resistance was not measured in speeches or declarations, but in daily survival. When the banking systems froze, families found themselves unable to withdraw savings. Mothers waiting at ATMs were greeted only by error codes. Remittances from relatives abroad, a lifeline worth more than $400 million annually, were suddenly severed. For a nation where 1 in 4 households depends on these flows, the disruption was more than inconvenience. It was hunger. Shops in Ouagadougou reported dwindling supplies as electronic payments faltered. Traders in the bustling markets faced losses as transactions collapsed. The hum of everyday life, the exchange of goods, the paying of school fees, the remittances that fuel small businesses, was brought to a standstill by the invisible hand of cyber warfare. Each lost transaction was a reminder that in modern conflict, sovereignty could be shaken not only by bullets, but by the flicker of a screen. Politically, the ultimatum became a crucible. Within Burkina Faso, Traoré's decision to reject resignation transformed his image. Once seen by some as an untested young officer, he was recast as a symbol of national pride. The chants of the streets, "We choose Traoré," echoed into the chambers of government, giving his administration a legitimacy that no foreign recognition could bestow. Regionally, the implications were profound. The African Union issued a rare and urgent statement condemning external interference and forced regime change. In Bamako and Niamey, leaders recognized the shadow of their own vulnerabilities. If Burkina Faso fell, what stopped the same demands from being imposed on them tomorrow? In that moment, the ultimatum ceased to be a local crisis. It became a continental warning. The response of neighboring states revealed a delicate balance. Economies in the Sahel, already fragile, could not afford disruption. A single halt in trade routes risked losses measured in millions of dollars. Yet aligning with the ultimatum carried its own costs. Legitimacy eroded, sovereignty bartered away. Thus, solidarity, even if cautious, began to outweigh submission. At home, Traoré harnessed the storm to build political capital. His speeches reframed the crisis as a battle for dignity rather than a contest of might. He reminded citizens that Burkina Faso's gold and oil were not mere commodities for others to exploit, but seeds of future prosperity. His words resonated with a people who had endured decades of being treated as a resource-rich, yet voiceless nation. The pain, however, was real. Families went without access to funds. Businesses faltered. Students found their scholarships delayed. Farmers struggled to purchase fertilizer as digital transactions collapsed. It was a reminder that defiance carried a cost paid not by elites in palaces, but by citizens in markets, schools, and villages. Internationally, markets reflected the uncertainty. European analysts whispered about African risk premiums. Wall Street traders speculated on whether Burkina Faso's fragile reserves, barely $2 billion, would evaporate. Yet the resilience of the streets countered the arithmetic of analysts. For while dollars disappeared, conviction multiplied. It was in this crucible that the concept of sovereignty shifted. It was no longer an abstract principle debated in parliaments or signed in treaties. It was lived reality, measured in the empty shelves of markets, the chants of protesters, the darkened homes after cyber attacks. Sovereignty was not only the right to govern, but the ability to endure storms without surrendering the soul of the nation. The countdown, intended to weaken Traoré, paradoxically strengthened him. By surviving 48 hours of pressure, he demonstrated that leadership could be exercised not through submission, but through refusal. This was the paradox of the ultimatum. Designed to isolate, it instead united. The world began to frame it as the Ibrahim Traoré coup that never happened. A coup threatened from the outside, resisted from within. And yet questions lingered. Could Burkina Faso sustain this defiance when its economy was bleeding? Would international solidarity translate into lasting support? Or was it only a temporary chorus? As the ultimatum expired and Traoré remained in power, the question was not whether Burkina Faso had survived, but whether this fragile survival could become the foundation for a new political order. Beyond the streets of Ouagadougou, the ultimatum echoed across continents. What had begun as a local test of will quickly grew into a diplomatic storm. The African Union, often accused of silence, issued a rare statement condemning any attempt at forced regime change. For once, the language was not cautious diplomacy, but a sharp rebuke. Sovereignty, the AU declared, was not negotiable. Neighboring states, though wary, sensed the stakes. Leaders in Mali, Niger, and Chad had faced similar pressures in the past, and they knew that Burkina Faso's struggle was also their own. If one nation could be dictated to, so could they. Thus, even governments that usually treaded carefully found themselves voicing solidarity, recognizing that stability purchased through submission would be no stability at all. In the wider world, reactions revealed the fractures of a multipolar order. Russia amplified its support, offering gestures of military cooperation and political backing in global forums. Iran positioned itself as a defender of digital sovereignty, reminding the world that in the 21st century, wars were fought as much with algorithms as with arms. China, with characteristic pragmatism, extended soft loans and infrastructure pledges, framing itself not as a colonizer, but as a partner in development. Western powers, however, responded differently. Media outlets carried reports portraying Traore as reckless and isolated. Financial analysts warned of economic collapse. In Washington and Brussels, the narrative emphasized instability, a word that often masked deeper concerns about resource access and geopolitical influence. Yet behind closed doors, unease grew. If Burkina Faso could withstand pressure, would others in Africa or even beyond draw courage from its example? The most striking outcome was the birth of the Ouagadougou Pact. 23 African nations came together to sign an agreement unlike any before. Its promise was simple but radical. No state would face an ultimatum alone. If one was threatened, all would respond. For a continent long divided by borders drawn in colonial capitals, this was a declaration of unity forged in defiance. Economists noted that the collective GDP of the signatories exceeded $1.6 trillion, a figure that transformed the idea of Africa from a cluster of fragile markets into a bloc with genuine leverage. It was within this context that observers began to speak of a Burkina Faso revolution. Not a revolution of guns or coups, but of dignity and political agency. The narrative was shifting. Africa was no longer the passive recipient of decisions made elsewhere. It was beginning to dictate terms, to imagine alternatives, to chart a path less dependent on the currencies and contracts of outsiders. But could this newfound unity endure once the spotlight dimmed? Or was it only the heat of crisis that bound these nations together? When the 48 hours ended without collapse, without resignation, without a coup, a new chapter began. Survival itself became a message that even the smallest nations can outlast the weight of ultimatums if they choose conviction over fear. But survival was not enough. The question now was whether Burkina Faso could transform defiance into a sustainable future. 1 year later, the evidence was clear. Contracts once signed under pressure were renegotiated. Mining deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars were rewritten to ensure a greater share of profits remained within Burkina Faso. The revenue funded schools, hospitals, and energy projects, not as charity from abroad, but as dividends of sovereignty. What had begun as a threat had become an opportunity to reset the rules of engagement. 3 years after the ultimatum, Ibrahim Traoré stood at the podium of the United Nations General Assembly. This time, he was not a nervous young officer struggling for recognition. He was greeted with a standing ovation, not out of protocol but out of respect. Delegates representing economies totaling $90 trillion rose to applaud a leader from a $20 billion nation. Symbolism was overwhelming. Dignity, once dismissed as weakness, had become power. Culture carried the memory forward. Musicians released ballads of the 48 hours. Artists painted murals of a ticking clock transformed into a symbol of defiance. Filmmakers announced documentaries that framed the episode as a turning point in Africa's modern identity. The story of resistance was no longer confined to speeches and newspapers. It was etched into song, stone, and cinema. Across Africa, the moment sparked a wider awakening. The Ouagadougou Pact grew from an emergency alliance into the foundation of long-term strategies. Plans for an African monetary union, feasibility studies for a continental satellite network, and the proposal for an African Leadership Academy to train the next generation of leaders in geopolitics, economics, and cyber defense. What was once only a response to coercion had become a vision of independence. But challenges remain. Cyber vulnerabilities are real. Economic pressures are constant. Disinformation continues to erode truth. The victory of 48 hours does not erase the long road ahead. Yet what has changed is the psychology of power. The fear that once paralyzed small nations has been broken. For Burkina Faso, the choice ahead is clear: to turn this fragile survival into a durable path of sovereignty, partnership, and resilience. For Africa, the question is larger. Can unity forged in crisis become a shield against future storms? Or will it fragment once the pressure fades? The countdown ended, but a new clock has begun. Not one imposed from outside, but one that measures how long Africa can sustain its hard-won defiance. The ultimatum was supposed to break Burkina Faso. Instead, it birthed a legend. 48 hours once meant as a countdown to collapse became a clock of defiance, each tick a heartbeat of resistance, each minute a step toward reclaiming Africa's dignity. Ibrahim Traoré did not possess the arsenals of superpowers or the reserves of trillion-dollar economies. What he carried was clarity, the conviction that sovereignty is not for sale. By refusing to bend, he transformed fear into fuel. The Ibrahim Traoré coup that foreign powers anticipated never materialized. What emerged instead was the refusal of a nation to surrender its soul. Across the continent, the episode became more than a story of one leader. It was invoked in classrooms, sung in streets, etched in murals. The phrase Burkina Faso Revolution spread not as a call to arms, but as a declaration that Africa could stand, negotiate, and define its own terms. From Bamako to Nairobi, from Caracas to Manila, the lesson reverberated. Even the smallest voices can unsettle the loudest empires. Markets wavered. Corporations recalculated. Diplomats whispered of miscalculation. Yet for ordinary citizens of Burkina Faso, the meaning was simpler. They had endured blackouts, frozen accounts, disinformation storms, and still they stood. In the arithmetic of global politics, that survival was priceless. 1 year later, contracts were rewritten on Burkina Faso's terms. 3 years later, the United Nations rose to applaud a leader once dismissed as powerless. The 48 hours had become a symbol not of weakness, but of strength, not of dependence, but of dignity. Twice in history, superpowers underestimated Africa's resolve. And twice Africa replied not with collapse, but with endurance. So the question remains, was this a single victory or the opening of a new era? If one landlocked nation can resist, what stops the rest from breaking the chains of coercion? If 48 hours can become a milestone of defiance, what could 48 nations achieve with unity? This is not the end of a countdown. It is the beginning of a compass. If this story resonates with your sense of justice, share it, keep it alive, and let it guide the conversations of tomorrow. Subscribe and walk with us, for the journey of sovereignty has only just begun.